Hey everyone, welcome to today's Security Flash. My name is Casey Ellis. I'm the founder, chair, and CTO of Bugcrowd.
Hi, I'm Sajib Lahani, and I am the Director of Cybersecurity in Bugcrowd, leading the internal purple team.
And I promise you that we're not all Australian at Bugcrowd. We just, get the best ones on to do these security flashes. So there you go. So Saj, you and I have been talking over the weekend. Obviously, we're all back from Hacker Summer Camp, Black Hat and DEF CON, and all the goodness and amazing things that happened down there. But off the back of that, we had this series of Apple vulnerabilities come out, and we're going to talk about those today. So how about you lead it off?
Yeah, well, this bug is a pretty interesting one because it's basically remote code execution as kernel, which basically means that you automatically get root access, which is terrifying. It's unfettered access to everything. The very interesting thing is it's a vulnerability within Webkit, which basically means that it's actually going to affect any browser related to Webkit. So Safari, possibility of Chrome and things like that. And it's purely because a bounce check wasn't actually done correctly. So it's scary, it's exploitable, and it's likely already been seen in the wild. And yeah, it's a very, very patch right now type of vulnerability for sure.
No, for sure. So when you say WebKit, I just want to make sure that the listeners understand the scope. Like WebKit essentially is something that runs on just about everything Apple does, right? So we're talking, iOS, we're talking macOS, we're talking iPads, iPhones, thing that has a screen on it, as well as computers. That's accurate?
Definitely. So it's basically the technology used behind certain types of browsers. So there's Gecko type browsers and WebKit type browsers. And this was a vulnerability related to Apple products within the WebKit technology.
Yeah, for sure. And the fact that it's executing in kernel, I think the interesting thing to me from a vulnerability standpoint is oftentimes you'll see macOS vulnerabilities that aren't as impactful in iOS because of the sandboxing and different things that are implemented. With iOS devices, you've got generally a fairly integrated supply chain there, and Apple have spent a lot more time taking advantage of that to do sandboxing and all sorts of different things to create enclaves and trusted environments and so on, which is less true on a Mac OS laptop. But all of a sudden you've got a WebKit vulnerability that drops RCE directly into the kernel. That seems to have violated that kind of core product principle that they've got there.
Indeed, it really does take a big step back in the security, the kind of in-depth concept. Because when you've got kernel level access, there's very little you can't do.
Yeah.
And more so you can pivot into the right areas even if you can't directly access it.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, from an iOS exploit development standpoint, the necessity of chaining more and more things to get past sandboxing has been definitely something that's been talked about a lot over the past couple of years. But again, with this particular issue, we're kind of skipping all of that and dropping straight into ring zero. So bounce checking, can you talk a little bit about what that means in terms of the coding error, or some of the things that are involved in actually triggering this vulnerability?
Yeah, so bounds checking basically implies that it's kind of imagine like an if statement, checking the length of a string or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's trying to go and check whether or not the data that you're actually putting into wherever you're putting it is too big for the location that you're trying to place it in. That's the concept of bounds checking. In this case, there was insufficient bounds checking, which allows someone to go and overfill and overflow whatever data structure they were putting it in, which causes the issue.
Sounds like an old school. I'm getting flashbacks as you're describing that there.
Definitely.
Yeah, no, for sure. Okay, cool. So, from an exploitation standpoint, you mentioned, one of the things that was kind of pants on fire. This was, one of those vulnerabilities that I ended up getting a phone call, from my parents and like uncles and aunties about
Uh-huh.
after it dropped, because it got a lot of publicity, and from what I can see, like rightly so. One of the reasons for this kind of Sev 1 messaging that Apple took is that it has been observed being exploited in the wild, and that was one of the reasons that they accelerated the push and made such a big fuss. That's your understanding?
Yeah, so I've heard of different people actually seeing it in the wild. So obviously I can't state whether or not they're entirely correct. However, from my understanding, it does seem quite likely that it is currently being exploited, which has very much changed the kind of disclosure requirements or patching requirements for it.
Yeah, or the criticality of getting a patch put in place. I think the thing that jumped out to me on this, and something for the listeners to understand, if you haven't already gone off and started, obviously, I think first things first, when something like this happens with a consumer kind of quasi BYOD, quasi enterprise, product like most of Apple's set of products, making sure that you and your family are patched first, I think, is actually not a bad starting point, especially in this era of work from home. You don't want your family getting owned, obviously, and if you're reliably working from home, then they, ostensibly provide a springboard into your corporate environment, even though you might be patched, for example. So that's a good starting point that everyone can take advantage of. But in terms of enterprise, IT rollouts, if you've got an enterprise fleet of custom apps that require regression testing, all those different things, the fact that it is being exploited in the wild, I think, is a really important thing to factor into how you prioritize that. It's not an academic vulnerability. It's the likelihood, even if those who have or possess the exploit right now aren't necessarily targeting your organization, the fact that it's known to be targetable and there's enough information out there around how this thing works, that combined with the patch is going to basically accelerate other people discovering how to actually trigger this thing, and the likelihood of that exploit being more widely available in a shorter space of time is quite high.
Definitely.
Cool.
Something that I would also like to...
What else? Yeah, sorry, cut you off there.
Something I'd also like to make sure we kind of very explicitly state is the fact that it's not just laptops, it's not just phones, it's also iPads and basically anything that has the ability to run a browser within the Apple flag.
Yeah.
So anything under that umbrella. So it goes back quite a lot. So things like iPhone 6s and things.
Yep.
So even your old devices, any iPad Pro, everything technically could be vulnerable. So just make sure you're up to date. Pretty much at my household, all we did was put all the laptops down on one big table and just went through and started updating everything one after another.
So if it's got an Apple logo and a screen, you should be thinking about this. Is going to be okay, cool. Any other advice, I guess, for actually jumping to one of the things that we often bring up on these, if you're a hunter, so switching roles from defense to offense and thinking about this from the bounty hunter or the security researcher side of things, what can you do with this? Like what's the potential for use of this type of or this particular vulnerability in the context of offensive security work?
Well, it's quite rare that certain Mac-related or Apple-related scope. But there are actually a few places where it is. So in those types of scenarios, it's probably a fair bit of work to actually go and try to reverse engineer the exact exploit. But it basically does show that there are weaknesses within those specific types of technologies. So basically off this, with the amount of publicity this has gotten, I wouldn't be amazed if other people started actually trying to dive deeper into this specific vein of exploits.
Yeah, for sure. No, I've definitely heard some outside of traditional kind of outside in bug bounty work. Some of the stuff that Bugcrowd does internally. Talking to the pen test crews within the organization and what we deliver, and even some of the red teaming work that they've all been kind of licking their chops. The idea of having a persistent MacOS watering hole kind of RCE available for that type of engagement going forward. So there's definitely some excitement, to your point, around the fact that this hasn't really happened for a while, and that does seem to be available right now. But that also does indicate there's probably more dragons hiding out in that similar code base, and we'll likely see those kind of get flushed out over the next couple of months.
Indeed.
Yeah, very cool. All righty. Well, thanks, Sarge. I guess parting note would be
patch very quickly, please.
Very cool. All righty. Well, that's today's security flash. I think my kind of parting note on this one is it's not anytime there's like a pants on fire, everyone like tools down, red alert. Especially if you're running patch management for an enterprise, that's not actually what you want to do. You never want to panic and jerk your knee in response to these things, but you do, I think, want to take the proportionality of the impact that's being discussed around this type of issue and factor it into how quickly you're working out how you're going to actually roll out patches over time. So if there's ways that Bugcrowd can help you identify where that fits in with your overall risk posture, any other insight or input that we can give to help you along, feel free to reach out. And thank you. That's this week's Security Flash. Cheers.
Thanks.
And done.